So I just wanted to wrap something up about this whole neoliberal institutional thing you've been reading about. Basically, they aren't like the utopian liberals. They basically see the world as anarchic. And that's very important to understand because they just think that institutions, particularly international institutional regimes, can help create peace. So if you look at it, the United Nations kind of forces us to cooperate. They're under no delusion that the United Nations is going to stop things like the Iraq war, but can it facilitate this type of cooperation? And the economic liberals say the deepening of economic ties between countries essentially creates a self-interest between different states so that war and conflict are less likely, not impossible. So take, for example, a very good example is the European Union. You know, that started off as the European community. It started off in coal and steel because the thinkers of the time called, basically neoliberal institutionalism is an umbrella word for all these types of movements that believe in world integration. So for them, the European Union is basically the pinnacle of this. So the functionalists, and later what we call neo-functionalists, said if we're able to get the European states who have been warring for so long united under different integration processes, we can have peace. So what kind? Well, it first begins with coal and steel because that's what you use to kill each other at that time, war. So if we're able to integrate these key industrial areas, we're less likely to have war. And then the neo-functionalists later came up and said there's a lot of what we call spin-offs or externalities, positive externalities of these. Because what happens is that you see that not only do we need these, you know, the coal and steel, now we need railroads. Now we need schools, people learning different languages, people getting married, interrelated. So this is very, very important for the neo-functionalists. And it basically did work to a certain degree, because if you walk around Europe now and say, you know, is Germany going to fight France in a war? Absolutely not. I mean, that's pretty amazing. So the neoliberals or neoliberal institutionalists, whatever you want to call them, that believe in any type of integration, whether it's economic, monetary, right? Now, many of these countries share the euro. You know, it could be through environmental, the Kyoto agreements, these kind of environmental regimes and institutions, etc., will help create peace. It forces you to cooperate. And moreover, you basically are tied with someone. So if we go to war with China, when I say the United States, then we lose because we get so much from China. And China loses because it exports so much to us. So it's kind of like this interdependence that exists between nations. And then you have even more spin-offs, like, for example, the Fulbright program in the United States, which was created by the senator of Arkansas to have students go abroad and students come here so we understand ourselves better. So this whole idea of neoliberal institutionalism, it's an umbrella term for just a broad spectrum of ways to integrate. The European Union, for me, is absolutely amazing because you took these different countries and integrated them with a parliament, judicial branch, etc. The one thing that does support the more neoliberalists is Brexit, the idea that it would disintegrate after the Cold War, because neoliberalists focus so much on security that they said after there's no fear of the Soviet Union, the European community, now the European Union, is going to disintegrate. But it didn't. But Brexit, they say, is a, you know, possible fissure within this system. So we're going to have to see what happens. But the same with NATO. NATO is part of it, even though it's a security, right, to balance Russia, right, the Warsaw Pact. NATO still is part of the neoliberal institutionalist paradigm because you're basically integrating these different states, right, in a military way. Then we share information, share intelligence, share just a broad range of things, whatever those things are. And even marriage matters. So when you look at Brexit, either that is the Great Britain breaking from the European Union. It's interesting because then people in Britain, might say, hey, I married a Brit, I'm from Poland, what happens now? So it was so integrated, what's going to happen with the Ireland border, etc. Now, if you are supportive of Brexit and you're from like Great Britain, then, we have this all figured out. I don't think they did. And I think the European Union states, the most powerful ones, Germany, France, etc., have made it so difficult for the Brits. So, in order to, basically curb any tendencies of a Grexit, that's Greek exit, or Italexit, or whatever it's called, Italy leaving, etc. So, but, this is what the neoliberalists study. And their argument is, yes, we live in anarchy. They recognize that, like the neoliberalists, but we can basically get along and cooperate under certain conditions with these international institutions. And then they build what we call regimes, that is, normalized ways of how we act. So we have the International Court of Justice. Now we have the ICC. The neoliberalists love this stuff. And I also wanted to note, behind me is UNASUR, but UNASUR doesn't exist anymore. But that was an initiative between the Southern states, South American states. This is a picture I took when I was there. I did research there. And because when, the lefties were overthrown by the right wingers without with an obvious thing, you saw it in Ecuador, Bolivia, although they voted in Evo Morales' or former economic advisor that was very popular, it's in Ecuador, Quito, Ecuador, and it was Lenin Moreno. I wrote an article on it, and he basically shuttered it. And it did have value. It basically entailed the South American states. And I'm authoring an article now on how this created space for conflict resolution strategies that would have otherwise never been considered. And one of the key case studies is the border between Venezuela and Colombia, which has been a historical issue. This isn't just under Hugo Chavez or anyone else, but basically UNASUR helped facilitate cooperation between the two nations. And under Colombia, under a conservative president, Santos, who was Uribe's defense minister, so no lefty, that is left winger. So, and he actually said it worked well, and they reestablished relations. Now relations are really bad, but the point is a regional institution did help solve peace. And then I'm doing other stuff on more regional institutions like Cuba, helping, serving as space to help Colombia get out of almost a 50-year-long civil war, where Cuba allowed certain space for the conflict resolution policies and the peace process to go forward. And that was a conservative president, again in Colombia, because Colombia's only had conservative presidents, Santos, who was the minister of defense under a man named Uribe, who's very conservative, and entered into a peace process. So, these kind of cooperative initiatives are what the neoliberal institutionalists look at. And so they look at cooperation among states. So for them, anarchy exists. Let me be perfectly clear. And if you ever get a chance to go to Ecuador, what is it, Ecuador, you got to do it. This is like the middle of the world or something, right by the equator, and they have all these kinds of things. It's really cool. But they shuttered this business, this regional institution, and it really did do well because the United States basically dominates the Organization of American States, which is what you're going to see in the other lecture. The question is, are these institutions for the people to create peace, or are they for powerful interests? That's kind of another issue that we'll get into later, because that is an important thing to say. So when you look at like the Organization of American States, that is the regional institution of the Americas, it's completely dominated by the United States. That's why there are initiatives to create alternative regional organizations to the Organization of American States, the OAS, which is kind of a mouthpiece historically for the United States. And that's where we get into the World Bank, the WTO, IMF, et cetera. Are these independent institutions, or are they institutions that serve as vehicles for world powers? And that's something you're going to have to conclude. But I'll just finish this by saying the neoliberal institutionalists recognize anarchy like the neo-realists. However, and that's a big however, they do see that there's conditions of peace, and the peace can be facilitated by regional and international organizations. And if you look at, like, for example, economic liberals, their argument is the deeper we are interconnected through economics, the more difficult we can have or we will have conflict. You know, it's just like Friedman's, as you'll read, Big Mac theory, country with a McDonald's and another McDonald's and another country have never gone to war. First, that's absolutely not true. You know, we could do different wars, cyber wars, wars of attrition. Nicaragua had a McDonald's. We went to war with Nicaragua, El Salvador. You know, people forget, you know, Georgia and Russia both had McDonald's. It's a little, you know, far-fetched. However, the point is McDonald's serves as a symbol of international investment, like a stamp of approval, and then more investment comes, and you'll be less likely to have conflict if you're more integrated into the international system. And that came up when I hosted a conference at Myanmar, that Myanmar isn't extremely embedded and integrate into the international system, so it can. The coup was able to happen easily. So you can't, like, sanctions. Do sanctions work? Well, you have to be integrated into the world economy for sanctions to work, right? So, but this becomes problematic because, you know, the neoliberal institutionalists, they make some good points, right? I mean, yeah, we have cooperated under certain conditions. International and regional institutions can help create peace. Like, I would even make that argument with UNASUR and other regional organizations and initiatives in South America. Cuba and Colombia served as an incredible relationship of example of South-South relationships where they were able to get peace in Colombia. The Declaración de Orinoco, a few people know, is that's when Venezuela actually bailed out Argentina, so it didn't have to follow IMF policies. Was a big success that very few people know. That I authored an article on all this. So, but the point is, then why do we have these regional organizations or international organizations? Are they for the people? Are they for peace? Are they for economic development? Or are they for big interests? Like, for example, the World Bank pushing privatization of Bolivian water, which was a disaster, which resulted in the rise of the indigenous president, Evo Morales. This becomes, you know, the main question. And it is true. I authored an article. I published an article in La Prensa. That was a very famous newspaper in Nicaragua. And the owner, Chamorro, was actually killed by Somoza, and that was one of the main things that galvanized the revolution in 1979. I wasn't around then. I'm not that old. But I published an article, you know, kind of criticizing, but not fully, you know, something like a Joseph Stiglitz would argue or something, about the World Bank and IMF. And the World Bank and IMF called my house when I was living in Nicaragua and told me I'm not allowed to publish. So that's a little sketchy. You know, if you're going to sit there, the IMF and World Bank say, oh, we're so democratic, we support democracy, and then they call you up and say, you can't publish. And I'm talking to one of the guys from the IMF, and he's like, you can't publish this stuff. And I said, but I did publish this stuff. I thought we were in a free world. And he's like, no, you have to talk to us first. I'm like, I don't work for you. I'm like an individual. This is crazy. But this is how these organizations also operate. They're not always these, you know, facilitating peace, democracy, etc. They're essentially to another level. They're fraught with powerful interests, people making a ton of money, right? You know, oh, I'm going to get a job at the United Nations, I'm going to get a job at the IMF or the World Bank, and just make a ton of money, right? And get maybe a university post to something like that, and that's not tax money. So, you know, does it serve the interests of the people, or does it serve the interests of a certain elite that works at those institutions? I go both ways. I think sometimes they can be good, right? You know, like I'm saying, I think the United Nations does some good stuff abroad. I think they do stuff on gender rights, etc. I think they were involved, for example, the United Nations in collecting the guns and all the weaponry of the Colombian Civil War, although I don't know if it was exactly a civil war because there's always other countries getting involved, particularly the United States. But regardless, you needed the United Nations to, no one else has the power to go into Colombia and the credibility and to go in and get those weapons. And that's very, very important for the United Nations to do. So the United Nations has helped create peace. On the other hand, right, these institutions are also fraught with interests, very powerful interests. And do they work? It didn't stop the Iraq war. It didn't stop the genocide in Rwanda, etc. So that's why. And now we even have another thing called the WHO, and I'm not talking about the musical group, was never talked about until the COVID crisis, which makes international institutions even more interesting. I've been having debates about this, and it's very interesting, right? People say, they come to the conclusion, the WHO's not perfect, but we need it. And others say, no, it's beholden to the interests of certain countries. So the WHO is not valuable and we shouldn't be funding it. And this, I'll end, and I say I'll end like 17 times, is very, very interesting because should we be funding the WHO? Did the WHO do a good job, at least later, at informing the public and doing something to help address the COVID crisis? So this whole new WHO, like no one talked about the WHO before the COVID crisis, right? I've taught this class a billion times with, liberal institutionalism, etc. No one talked about the WHO. Now it's huge. So that's why I have debates. Is the WHO a workable, effective institution to deal with these diseases and pandemics? And I've really learned a lot from the students listening to these, both online and off in the in-class venue. So, but that's something for you people to decide. Thanks a lot for coming out. Again, that's UNASUR, that no longer exists. I took those photos. I did a big thing on it a while ago, not that long ago, but a while ago when I was doing research in Ecuador. That's in an area of Quito, very beautiful. It's like it's right on the equator, and they have these kind of cool things there. It's kind of touristy. But I really want you to start thinking about the role of these institutions, because these have real policy implications. So without further ado, I'll stop there, and because I can go on forever. And I really appreciate you coming out.